Hey guys, it's Dani. Alrighty, today we're gonna talk about how to rebloom one of the most beautiful orchids in the world, the Phalaenopsis orchid. Now I do have a very old tutorial on this matter and it's a pretty popular video, but it was a long time ago. I didn't have a proper camera, I didn't have studio lights and so on, and I just cringe every time I see it. So let us redo the video, make it better, easier to watch. And also, besides the flower shop Phalaenopsis that we all know and love, I'm going to include the tutorial for the summer blooming species and their wonderful hybrids. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post on a regular basis daily for the main part and only videos about orchids. And with that said, let's start the tutorial. Now let's start with the beginning. In order for our orchid to be able to produce a brand new flower spike, it needs space. And this can only be achieved by growth. You might have noticed that flower spikes on Phalaenopsis orchids emerge from between the leaves. Once a flower spike has formed in between one of the leaf joints, no other flower spike will ever emerge from there. And you can see on my orchid I do have a stump here. This is an old and dried flower spike. A new one will not be produced from here. Generally, flower spikes are only produced from between the leaves. And in order to do so, they need space. Leaf joints can only be created by leaves. So first and foremost, our orchid needs to grow new leaves. Phalaenopsis orchids produce 2 to 3 leaves per year. So presuming you have a Phalaenopsis which was in bloom last year, this year in its blooming season, it will need to have a new leaf joint to produce a flower spike. Generally, a new flower spike emerges from the second leaf joint if you look on one side of the orchid. So in my case, you can see that I have a leaf here, one here, and right below it I have a flower spike. That is a typical location for a new spike to emerge. So rule number 1, our orchid needs to grow in order to have the space for the flower spike. Rule number 2, Phalaenopsis are seasonal bloomers. Now just for the record, when I talk about reblooming this orchid, I don't mean the existing flower spike creating new flowers or a new branch. That's a different story. I am referring to brand new flower spikes that emerge from between the leaves. So as I was saying, Phalaenopsis typically only produce new flower spikes only once a year, and the season for that is typically autumn or winter. In these seasons, the flower spikes will emerge, and throughout autumn and winter, the flower spikes will grow, they will form the buds, and somewhere at the end of winter or beginning of spring, you should have the first blooms opening. So if you received a Phalaenopsis orchid in bloom and the blooms withered, you had to cut the flower spike because it was dry, and it's already been 3 months, and you're wondering why your orchid is not blooming, well, maybe it's not the season yet. So don't despair. And rule number 3, they need the trick to prompt them into blooming. Yes, it has to do with temperature. Phalaenopsis orchids are triggered into blooming through a drop in temperature. From experience, I can tell you this drop is not really dramatic. A temperature between 17 and 18 degrees Celsius, and you'll have the conversion to Fahrenheit on the screen, provided for a period of 2 to 4 weeks, should be enough to prompt these orchids into producing flower spikes. And as it just so happens, for most of us, this drop in temperature happens in autumn or in winter. And actually, this is the secret in reblooming Phalaenopsis orchids, even for nurseries. Have you ever wondered why you can find Phalaenopsis available all year long in flower shops if they're only triggered by lower temperatures? Well, that's because nurseries control the temperatures in the greenhouses where they grow these orchids, so they can trick them into thinking it's autumn anytime they want. It's a little bit more complicated than that because we have to think about the growth aspect. Remember, rule number 1. But for the main part, nurseries do have means to control temperature in their environment and provide us with beautiful Phalaenopsis whenever we want. Now, because these orchids respond to temperature, some people do have slight issues in reblooming these orchids. For example, if you grow your Phalaenopsis in a home with constant temperature throughout the year, you might find that your Phalaenopsis either delays blooming, either blooms at a very wrong time of the year whenever it feels maybe a little bit of a colder draft, and so on and so forth. If you live in a warmer climate which doesn't have a seasonal cool down, you might have some issues. It's very relative when it comes to these things. I have viewers in tropical climates who really struggle reblooming these orchids, while others don't really have issues. The genetics of the orchid, the use of an air conditioning, a slight drop in temperature, which you might not perceive but the orchid might perceive it, can actually make it bloom if the orchid gets adjusted to the environment. But these are details which pertain to every environment. So there are of course exceptions, but the sure way to rebloom them, if you can provide this, is by offering the drop in temperature. If you cannot do it during daytime, during nighttime it is enough, for 2 to 4 weeks. The American Orchid Society suggests 2. My experience is about 3 weeks, but some orchids are a little bit lazy, so the more the better. 4 weeks should be enough to induce blooming. Now, some people or articles will suggest that day length plays a role as well. It may or it may not. My experience has been that it doesn't really affect reblooming Phalaenopsis. In my previous environment, which was a temperate climate, I was living in Romania, the spikes on all of my Phalaenopsis started to emerge in September. Here in Cyprus, due to the different climate, flower spikes are initiated in November. In September, obviously the day is longer than in November, even in this climate, so I cannot really tell you that day length plays a role. For me, temperature is actually more important, so that is what I think you should focus on when you want to rebloom your Phalaenopsis orchid. So for those of us who live in climates which naturally have a distinction between winter and summer, initiating flower spikes is not a problem. Just make sure that you let your orchid experience at least the nighttime temperatures, which are naturally lower. Just leave the window open. If outside you have 17 to 18 degrees Celsius, 16, 15, everything is okay. And if you live in a climate which doesn't really have this distinction and you find that you do indeed have issues reblooming your Phalaenopsis, an air conditioning can work. Also in the nighttime, maybe use a fan to move the air around. A cool mist humidifier can work as well, or any other means that you can come up with to lower the temperature at least to 19 degrees Celsius. Some orchids respond to a warmer temperature than that, some orchids don't. They're very complex hybrids and they're not all alike. But for the vast majority of cases, the cool down absolutely works, and this is how I can explain that all of my Phalaenopsis orchids are in bloom at the same time, which is right now. Okay, before we move on to the summer blooming species, let me remind you to check the description. I'll share with you many things related to Phalaenopsis flower spikes. I have a video on recognizing a flower spike and a root. I have a tutorial on how to create the beautiful waterfall effect on Phalaenopsis orchids, and also a video on where and how to cut orchid flower spikes for Phalaenopsis orchids. Because at some point flowers will fade and you kind of need to know what to do next. So check the description down below for all of these videos. And with this said, let us move on to the other group of Phalaenopsis, which is popular on the market right now. Flower shop Phalaenopsis orchids are usually complex hybrids which belong to the Phalaenopsis subgenus. There are other Phalaenopsis subgenera as well, and one of them is the Polychilus or Polychilus, depending what area of the world you're in, you're gonna pronounce it differently. For the fun of it, let's just pronounce it Polychilus. The species and the hybrids in these subgenus are a little bit different than the standard Phalaenopsis orchids. This is what we call the flower shop phals. They look different, they have smaller flowers, but the pigment is a little bit brighter. The flowers are thick and waxy, and there is also a fragrance to these orchids. You cannot really find them in flower shops all over the world. Maybe in the United States you might, but definitely in orchid nurseries online and on location you should find these orchids. I'm not gonna go into the details of how to care for them. Check the description down below. I have a tutorial. But these orchids are not like the standard ones. They are not prompted into blooming by the cool down in winter. So first off, they do indeed need to grow vegetatively before we can think about a flower spike. The spike on them emerges from the very same place as the standard Phalaenopsis, 2 leaves below at the joint. They are also seasonal bloomers, just like the standard Phalaenopsis, but they bloom in spring to summer. So they're actually the other way around. A cool down doesn't induce blooming, but warmer temperatures and even more abundant light definitely triggers the creation of new flower spikes. And not only, These orchids are sequential bloomers, meaning from the very same flower spike, you can have flowers emerging year after year for multiple years, unlike the standard Phalaenopsis, which can keep a flower spike for a maximum of 2 years. So with these orchids, instead of cooling them down, you need to maintain them warm and in a bright shade location. Because the flower spikes are sequential, never cut them unless they are completely dry. Once a year, these orchids can produce new flower spikes from the leaf joints while still maintaining the old flower spikes, and in the end, after years, you can have a beautiful multifloral display on these orchids as well. Needless to say, I don't have a tutorial on how to cut flower spikes on these orchids because you just don't unless it's dry. But as I was saying, I do have a tutorial on how to care for them, so do check the description down below. In our temperate climates, they only bloom in the warmer months. And that is about it on reblooming Phalaenopsis orchids. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and you know the drill. If you did enjoy it, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!